The flames danced higher than the tallest trees on that fateful night in 1878, as Charlotte Keating watched her entire world crumble to ash, along with the smooth skin of her face and arms that would never feel the same again. Standing amid the smoldering ruins of her family's homestead outside Helena, Montana, she couldn't have imagined that, 5 years later, her scars would become the very thing that led her to true love. Charlotte's honey blonde hair fell over her right cheek as she stood on Helena's dusty Main Street, clutching her market basket. She had developed the habit of using her hair as a curtain to shield the right side of her face from prying eyes. The spring breeze threatened to expose her secret, and she quickly raised her hand to secure the loose strands. "Miss Keating, I have those books you ordered," called Mr. Paulson from the doorway of his general store. Charlotte nodded gratefully and entered the dimly lit establishment. The familiar scent of leather, coffee, and tobacco greeted her, a comforting constant in her otherwise lonely existence. "3 new novels from back east," Mr. Paulson said, sliding the brown paper package across the counter. "Romance, just as you requested." "Thank you," Charlotte replied softly. Romance novels had become her escape, her only taste of love in a world that had turned its back on her. At 24, she had long since abandoned hope of finding her own love story. "That'll be 60 cents, he said, watching her sympathetically. As Charlotte counted out the coins, the bell above the door jingled. She didn't turn, having learned that new faces meant new opportunities for stares or poorly disguised revulsion. "Afternoon, Mr. Paulson," called a deep, resonant voice that Charlotte didn't recognize. "Got any nails?" "We're fixing the corral at the Rocking W. Just got a fresh shipment, Mr. Walker," Mr. Paulson replied cheerfully. Charlotte gathered her books, keeping her face angled away from the newcomer. She turned to leave, eyes downcast, when her basket caught on a display of canned goods. The basket tumbled from her grasp, spilling its contents across the wooden floor. "Oh," she gasped, immediately crouching to gather her belongings, using her hair to shield her face. "Let me help you, miss," said the stranger, kneeling beside her. "No, please," Charlotte began, but it was too late. As she reached for a fallen apple, her hair shifted, revealing the web of scars that traced from her right temple down her cheek and neck, disappearing beneath her high-collared dress. She froze, waiting for the inevitable, the sharp intake of breath, the hasty retreat, the mumbled excuse. It had happened dozens of times before. The man paused, his hand hovering over a loaf of bread that had rolled near his boot. Charlotte braced herself, preparing for rejection. Instead, his deep voice simply asked, "You like sourdough too?" Charlotte looked up in surprise, meeting the bluest eyes she'd ever seen set in a sun-weathered face. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with chestnut hair that curled slightly at his collar and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a generous mouth. He was smiling not with pity but with genuine warmth. Yes," she managed. He handed her the loaf. "Best in town, according to my foreman. Though I reckon Mrs. Finch over at the boarding house might argue that point." Charlotte accepted the bread, stunned by his casual manner. He continued helping her collect her items, showing no discomfort at her appearance. "I'm Lucas Walker," he said, offering his hand after placing the last apple in her basket. "Bought the old Rocking W ranch last month." "Charlotte Keating," she replied, hesitantly taking his hand. His palm was calloused but warm. "I work at the millinery shop." "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Keating," Lucas said, tipping his hat before returning to his business with Mr. Paulson. Charlotte hurried from the store, her heart pounding with confusion. Lucas Walker had looked directly at her scarred face and hadn't flinched. It was so unexpected that she hardly knew what to make of it. That evening, Charlotte sat in her small room above the millinery shop. fingers tracing the raised ridges of scarred tissue along her cheek. Before the fire, she had been considered a beauty, with numerous suitors calling at her father's prosperous ranch. After the tragedy claimed her parents and brother, leaving her with both emotional and physical scars, those same suitors had disappeared like morning mist. Charlotte had rebuilt her life with quiet determination. Mrs. Jenkins, the milliner, had taken pity on her, offering both employment and the small room upstairs. She'd learned to make herself useful, to exist in the shadows of Helena society. But Lucas Walker's straightforward kindness had stirred something she'd thought long dead: hope. She opened one of her new novels but found herself unable to concentrate on the printed words. Instead, blue eyes and a genuine smile kept intruding on her thoughts. The following day, Charlotte was arranging a new display of spring bonnets when the shop bell chimed. She turned, expecting to see one of Helena's society ladies, but instead found Lucas Walker filling the doorway, hat in hand. "Good morning, Miss Keating," he said, looking somewhat uncomfortable among the feminine finery. "Mr. Walker," Charlotte acknowledged, unconsciously shifting to present her unscarred profile. "Can I help you find something?" "I hope so," he replied, approaching the counter. "My sister's birthday is next month, and I thought a new hat might be appropriate. She's coming to visit from St. Louis. Of course. Does she prefer feathers or flowers, bold colors or subdued?" Lucas ran a hand through his hair, looking perplexed. "I reckon I don't know. We've been corresponding by letter, but she hasn't mentioned her hat preferences." Despite her nervousness, Charlotte smiled. "Perhaps something versatile, then. May I show you a few options?" For the next half hour, Charlotte guided Lucas through selections while Mrs. Jenkins watched with undisguised curiosity from her workroom. He eventually settled on a handsome blue bonnet trimmed with cream ribbons. "This will complement most complexions and outfits," Charlotte explained, wrapping it carefully. "My sister has eyes like mine," Lucas said. "I think the blue will suit her." As Charlotte handed him the package, their fingers brushed briefly. "Thank you for your assistance, Miss Keating. I wonder—" He hesitated, then continued with renewed resolve. "Would you consider joining me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening?" Charlotte's hand stilled. "I beg your pardon, dinner," Lucas repeated. "I'm still new to Helena and could use some pleasant company." The invitation was so unexpected that Charlotte was momentarily speechless. She hadn't dined in public since the fire, preferring to take meals in her room or at Mrs. Jenkins' table. "I don't think that would be wise, Mr. Walker," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "May I ask why not?" His direct question carried no challenge, only genuine inquiry. Charlotte touched her scarred cheek instinctively. "People stare." Lucas studied her face for a long moment. "Let them," he said simply. "I'd be honored by your company, Miss Keating." Before she could formulate another refusal, Mrs. Jenkins emerged from the back room. "Charlotte, dear, you should accept Mr. Walker's kind invitation. You haven't had an evening out in ages." Trapped between Mrs. Jenkins' encouragement and Lucas's steady gaze, Charlotte found herself nodding reluctantly. 7 o'clock. His smile could have lit the darkest night. "I'll call for you here at 7:15. After he left, Mrs. Jenkins squeezed Charlotte's hand. "That man looked at you like you hung the moon, scars and all." "Don't be ridiculous," Charlotte murmured, though a tiny spark kindled in her heart. That evening, Charlotte scrutinized her limited wardrobe, finally selecting her best dress, a deep green silk that her mother had ordered from Chicago the Christmas before the fire. She hadn't worn it since, and it required considerable courage to remove it from its tissue wrapping. The following evening, as the clock approached 7:15, Charlotte's courage began to falter. She had arranged her hair to partially cover her scarred cheek, but the damage was still evident. What if Lucas Walker had extended the invitation out of pity? What if he was embarrassed to be seen with her? The sound of boots on the stairs jolted her from her spiraling thoughts. Mrs. Jenkins appeared at her door, beaming. "He's here, Charlotte, and looking quite handsome." Taking a deep breath, Charlotte descended the stairs. Lucas stood in the shop, wearing a dark suit that transformed him from rancher to gentleman. His eyes widened appreciatively as she approached. "Miss Keating, you look beautiful," he said with such sincerity that Charlotte felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Lucas offered his arm and they stepped out into the early evening. The Helena Grand Hotel was only a short walk away, but to Charlotte, each step felt momentous. She hadn't walked arm in arm with a man since before the fire. "I reserved a table by the window," Lucas said as they entered the hotel's elegant dining room. "The view of the mountains at sunset is spectacular." Charlotte was acutely aware of the glances directed their way as a waiter led them to their table. She heard whispers, there were always whispers, but Lucas seemed oblivious, his attention focused solely on her. "I've been meaning to ask," he said after they were seated. "Have you lived in Helena long?" "5 years," Charlotte replied. "Before that, my family had a ranch about 20 miles east of here. The Keating place." "I've heard of it," Lucas said. "Fine horse breeding operation, as I recall," Charlotte nodded, surprised he knew of her family. "My father was very proud of his horses." Throughout dinner, Lucas proved himself an attentive companion and skilled conversationalist. He spoke of his ranch in Texas, which he'd sold to purchase the Rocking W, and of his plans to raise both cattle and horses in Montana. He asked Charlotte about her interests, listening intently to her answers. "You've read Wuthering Heights?" he asked with evident pleasure when she mentioned her love of literature. "What did you think of Heathcliff?" "A complicated character," Charlotte replied, delighted to discover Lucas shared her passion for books. "Passionate but ultimately destructive." As they continued talking, Charlotte gradually relaxed. Lucas never stared at her scars, never showed a moment's discomfort. By the time they finished their apple pie, Charlotte realized she hadn't once reached up to adjust her hair over her scarred cheek. Walking back to the millinery shop under a canopy of stars, Charlotte felt lighter than she had in years. At the shop door, Lucas took her hand. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, Miss Keating. I hope you'll allow me to call on you again." "I would like that," Charlotte admitted softly. "Sunday afternoon. Perhaps a drive out to see the countryside." Charlotte nodded, unable to suppress her smile. After bidding her good night, Lucas waited until she was safely inside before departing. Charlotte leaned against the closed door, her heart fluttering like a caged bird finally sensing freedom. Mrs. Jenkins appeared in her nightgown, candlestick in hand. "Well, how was it?" "Pleasant," Charlotte said, unwilling to reveal just how much the evening had affected her. "He seems like a fine man," Mrs. Jenkins observed, "and he clearly sees something special in you." "Perhaps," Charlotte allowed, though she dared not hope too much. One dinner didn't erase 5 years of rejection and loneliness. Sunday arrived with clear skies and gentle breezes, perfect weather for a drive. Charlotte wore a pale yellow dress and matching bonnet, taking extra care with her appearance. At precisely 2 o'clock, a smart buggy pulled up outside the shop, with Lucas handling the reins of 2 matching bay horses. "Your carriage awaits, Miss Keating," he called cheerfully as he helped her up onto the seat beside him. They drove through Helena and out into the rolling countryside beyond. Spring had painted the landscape with vibrant greens and wildflowers. Lucas pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his first month in Montana territory. "It's different from Texas," he said, "but there's something about these mountains that speaks to my soul." Charlotte understood perfectly. I've always loved Montana, even after. She trailed off, unconsciously touching her scars. Lucas guided the horses to a picturesque spot overlooking a small lake. He spread a blanket on the grass and produced a picnic basket from beneath the buggy seat. "Mrs. Finch at the boarding house packed this for us," he explained, unpacking cold chicken, biscuits, and fresh strawberries. As they ate, Charlotte found herself telling Lucas about her family, her father's devotion to his horses, her mother's love of music, her younger brother's mischievous nature. She hadn't spoken of them in so long that the words came haltingly at first, then flowed more freely. "How did it happen?" Lucas asked gently when she mentioned the fire. Charlotte stared across the lake. "A lightning strike during a summer storm. It hit the barn first. My father and brother went to save the horses." She swallowed hard. "My mother and I were in the house when burning debris from the barn roof landed on our porch. The whole house went up so quickly." "You survived," Lucas said, his voice filled with admiration rather than pity. "My mother pushed me through a window, but she couldn't follow. I tried to go back for her, but—" Charlotte gestured to her scarred face. The flames had already taken hold. "By the time help arrived from neighboring ranches, it was too late for my family." Lucas reached across the blanket and took her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss, Charlotte." "And I'm in awe of your courage." Charlotte looked down at their joined hands. "I wasn't brave, I just survived." "Sometimes surviving is the bravest act of all," Lucas said quietly. They sat in companionable silence, watching sunlight dance on the lake's surface. For the first time since the fire, Charlotte felt understood rather than pitied. Over the following weeks, Lucas became a constant in Charlotte's life. Their Sunday drives continued, supplemented by evening walks and occasional dinners at the hotel. Helena's citizens gradually became accustomed to seeing them together, though Charlotte still noticed curious glances and whispered comments. Lucas introduced Charlotte to his ranch hands and his foreman, Mr. Sullivan, who treated her with the same natural respect as their employer. She began to feel comfortable visiting the Rocking W, where Lucas was building a fine herd of cattle and had started acquiring quality breeding horses. "My father would have approved," she told Lucas one afternoon as they watched a spirited chestnut stallion in the corral. "He always said Montana-bred horses had more heart." "I wish I could have known your father," Lucas replied, "and I wish he could see how his daughter has the strongest heart of all." On a warm evening in June, nearly 2 months after their first meeting, Lucas invited Charlotte to dine at the Rocking W. He had hired a cook, Mrs. Gunderson, a Norwegian widow with a talent for pastry who prepared a sumptuous meal served in the ranch house's newly furnished dining room. "You've transformed this place," Charlotte observed, admiring the polished table and comfortable chairs that had replaced the sparse furnishings of the previous owner. "It's becoming a home," Lucas agreed, "though it still needs a woman's touch." After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass as twilight deepened. Charlotte felt a peace she hadn't known since before the fire. "My sister arrives next week," Lucas said. "I hope you two will become friends." "I look forward to meeting her," Charlotte replied, though anxiety flickered within her. Would Lucas's sister be as accepting of her appearance as he was? "There's something I've been wanting to tell you," Lucas continued, his voice taking on an uncharacteristic hesitation. "About why I came to Montana." Charlotte turned to him, curious. "I thought it was for the ranching opportunities." "Partly," Lucas acknowledged, "but there was another reason." He took a deep breath. "4 years ago, I was engaged to a woman in Dallas. Emily was her name. 2 weeks before our wedding, she was thrown from her horse. Her injuries were severe, her face was. Well, the doctors did what they could." Charlotte felt her heart constrict, suddenly understanding where his story was heading. I told her it didn't matter to me, Lucas continued, his voice rough with remembered pain. I loved her, not just her appearance, but she couldn't accept it. She broke our engagement, refused to see me. 6 months later, I learned she'd taken her own life. Oh, Lucas, Charlotte whispered, reaching for his hand. I moved to a different part of Texas, tried to forget, he said. But I carried the guilt that I somehow failed her, that I couldn't make her believe her scars didn't diminish my love. He looked directly at Charlotte. When I saw you in Paulson's store that day, with your head held high despite the whispers and stares, I thought, there's a woman with courage. Charlotte withdrew her hand. Is that why you've been so kind to me? Because I remind you of your lost fiancé? Lucas shook his head firmly. No, Charlotte. You reminded me that beauty exists in many forms, but it was your spirit that drew me to you. Your resilience, your kindness, your intelligence. I didn't pursue you out of pity or because of some unresolved past. I pursued you because from that first moment, I saw something in you that called to my soul. He took both her hands in his. I'm falling in love with you, Charlotte Keating, not despite your scars, but including them because they're part of what made you the extraordinary woman you are. Charlotte stared at him, tears filling her eyes. For 5 years, she had believed no man would ever look at her with love again. She had accepted a future of loneliness, telling herself it was enough to simply have survived. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything now, Lucas assured her. I just wanted you to know where my heart stands. When Lucas escorted her back to town that night, Charlotte's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. She believed Lucas's sincerity, yet fear still whispered in her ear. What if he eventually grew tired of the stares and whispers that followed them? What if, like every suitor before him, he ultimately couldn't bear the sight of her scars? Lucas's sister, Lillian, arrived on the eastbound train the following week. Charlotte had agreed to join Lucas in welcoming her, though anxiety knotted her stomach as they waited on the platform. There she is. Lucas called as a petite woman in a fashionable traveling suit descended from the train. Brother and sister embraced warmly before Lucas turned to introduce Charlotte. Lillian, this is Miss Charlotte Keating. Charlotte, my sister, Lillian Prescott. Charlotte braced herself for the flicker of shock or pity that inevitably crossed people's faces upon first meeting her. Instead, Lillian smiled warmly and clasped Charlotte's hand. Lucas has written so much about you in his letters, she said. I'm delighted to finally meet you. Over tea at the hotel, Charlotte found herself increasingly charmed by Lillian's forthright manner and quick wit. There was a strong resemblance between the siblings, not just in their blue eyes and chestnut hair, but in their genuine warmth. Lucas tells me you're quite knowledgeable about horses, Lillian remarked. I've always been terrified of the creatures myself. They can sense fear, Charlotte explained, but they also respond to gentle confidence. Perhaps you could teach me not to embarrass myself completely during my stay, Lillian suggested. Lucas has promised to show me his magnificent ranch, but I'd rather not view it entirely from inside a buggy. I'd be happy to help, Charlotte offered, surprised by how comfortable she felt with Lillian. As the women conversed, Lucas watched them with evident pleasure. When Lillian excused herself momentarily, he leaned closer to Charlotte. She likes you, he said softly. She's lovely, Charlotte replied honestly. You're fortunate to have such a sister. Lillian's 2-week visit transformed Helena's social landscape. As the sister of the prosperous new rancher and a charming, fashionable widow from St. Louis, she received numerous invitations. To Charlotte's astonishment, Lillian insisted on including her in every engagement. But people will talk, Charlotte protested when Lillian announced her intention to bring Charlotte to Mrs. Hollister's garden party, the most exclusive social gathering of Helena's summer season. People always talk, Lillian replied dismissively. Let them. You're my friend and Lucas's. She raised an eyebrow suggestively. We're not engaged, Lillian, Charlotte said quickly. Not yet, Lillian countered with a knowing smile. My brother isn't one to rush important decisions, but I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. The garden party proved less daunting than Charlotte had feared. With Lillian by her side and Lucas attentive to her comfort, she gradually relaxed enough to enjoy the string quartet and elaborate refreshments. Several of Helena's matrons, following Lillian's lead, engaged Charlotte in conversation, though whether from genuine interest or desire to curry favor with the Walker siblings remained unclear. You see, Lucas murmured as they strolled among Mrs. Hollister's prize roses. Not nearly as terrible as you imagined, Charlotte smiled ruefully. Only because you and Lillian acted as my shields. Nonsense, Lucas replied. You charmed Mrs. Judge Henderson entirely on your own. I saw her inviting you to her literary society meeting. It was true. The judge's wife had expressed interest in Charlotte's opinions on George Eliot and extended an invitation to the next meeting of Helena's most intellectual social circle. It's strange, Charlotte mused. For 5 years, I've lived as though invisible, and now suddenly I'm being included. You were never invisible, Charlotte, Lucas said seriously. You chose to hide, and people allowed you to do so because it was easier than confronting their own discomfort. His words struck home. Had she been complicit in her own isolation? As Lillian's visit neared its end, she and Charlotte had become genuine friends. The morning before her departure, Lillian invited Charlotte to help her pack, an invitation that turned into an impromptu fashion consultation. This green would suit you beautifully, Lillian said, holding a silk shawl against Charlotte's dress. It brings out the gold in your eyes. You must take it. I couldn't possibly consider it an early birthday gift, Lillian insisted. When is your birthday, by the way? August 15th, Charlotte replied, reluctantly accepting the shawl. Perfect. That gives Lucas plenty of time to plan something special. Charlotte blushed. Lillian, please don't encourage him to court you properly, Lillian finished with a laugh. My dear, he needs no encouragement from me. Lucas knows his own mind. Her expression softened. And his heart. After seeing Lillian off on the eastbound train, Lucas surprised Charlotte with a visit to the old Keating ranch. The property had been sold after the fire, and Charlotte hadn't returned since. Are you sure about this? Lucas asked gently as their buggy approached the familiar landscape. Charlotte nodded, though her hands clutched the seat tightly. It's time. The new owners had rebuilt the house and barns, though in different locations than the originals. The only remnant of Charlotte's childhood home was the stone foundation, now overgrown with wildflowers. Lucas helped her down from the buggy and remained respectfully silent as she walked among the ruins. Charlotte knelt to touch a piece of the foundation, memories washing over her mother playing the piano on winter evenings, her father's booming laugh, her brother's teasing. They would have liked you, she told Lucas when he finally approached. I hope so, he replied, helping her to her feet. I brought something for you and them. He returned to the buggy and came back with 4 rose bushes in burlap-wrapped root balls. I thought perhaps we could plant them here, he suggested. One for each of your family. Tears filled Charlotte's eyes at the thoughtful gesture. Together, they dug holes at each corner of the old foundation, planting the roses as a living memorial. Thank you, Charlotte whispered when they had finished. This means more than I can express. Lucas gently wiped a tear from her unscarred cheek. They live on through you, Charlotte. Your father's determination, your mother's grace, your brother's spirit, I see them all in you. Standing amid the wildflowers that had reclaimed her family home, Charlotte felt something shift within her, a burden lifting, a door opening to possibilities she had long denied herself. "Lucas," she said softly, "earlier you asked if I was sure about coming here. Now I have a question for you. Are you sure about me, about us?" Lucas took her hands in his. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. People will always stare. They'll whisper about your scarred wife." "Let them," he said, echoing his words from months ago. "I'll be too busy cherishing you to notice." Charlotte took a deep breath and voiced the fear that had haunted her. "What if someday you look at me and all you see are the scars?" Lucas cupped her face gently, his thumbs caressing both her smooth and scarred cheeks with equal tenderness. "Charlotte, when I look at you, I see courage and strength. I see intelligence and kindness. I see the woman who has captured my heart completely." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "You're perfect." In that moment, surrounded by wildflowers and newly planted roses, Charlotte finally believed him. She rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in their first kiss, sweet and full of promise. 3 weeks later, on a perfect August evening, Lucas proposed formally during a dinner at the Rocking W Ranch. He had transformed the porch into an enchanted garden with lanterns and flowers, and Mrs. Gunderson had outdone herself with a feast worthy of the occasion. When Lucas knelt before her chair and presented a diamond ring, Charlotte didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate speeches. Helena buzzed with news of the engagement. Most reactions were positive. Lucas had become well respected in the community, and Charlotte's recent social appearances with Lillian had helped reintegrate her into society. There were still whispers, of course, but they mattered less with each passing day. They married in October, when the cottonwood trees had turned golden. The ceremony took place at the Rocking W, with Lillian returning from St. Louis to stand with Charlotte. Mr. Sullivan served as Lucas's best man, and Mrs. Jenkins wept happily throughout the service. Charlotte wore a cream-colored gown with lace at the throat and wrists. She had considered a veil to obscure her scars, but ultimately decided against it. She would begin her married life as herself, scars and all. "You are the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," Lucas whispered as they exchanged vows before the minister and their gathered friends. That night, as Lucas's wife, Charlotte discovered another kind of healing. His tenderness as he undressed her, his reverent touch on both her smooth and scarred skin, his whispered words of love all combined to banish the last of her doubts. In his arms, she was whole, she was desired, she was perfect. Life at the Rocking W settled into a pleasant rhythm. Charlotte discovered she had a talent for breeding horses, reviving her father's legacy with Lucas's enthusiastic support. Together, they built a reputation for quality stock that drew buyers from as far as California. Charlotte also found herself increasingly involved in Helena's social and charitable activities. With Mrs. Judge Henderson's encouragement, she helped establish a lending library for the community and organized a fund for children orphaned by mining accidents. When Charlotte discovered she was expecting their first child the following spring, Lucas's joy knew no bounds. He had carpenters add a nursery to their home and ordered furnishings from St. Louis. Lillian sent a steady stream of tiny garments and excited letters. "You want a boy or a girl?" Charlotte asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Lucas placed his hand on her growing belly. "Either, as long as they have your courage." "And your kindness," Charlotte added, covering his hand with hers. Their son, James Thomas Walker, arrived on a snowy December night in 1879. He had Lucas's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair that stood straight up no matter how Charlotte tried to smooth it. "He's perfect," Lucas declared, cradling his son with awe. "Yes," Charlotte agreed, watching her husband and child with a heart so full it seemed impossible to contain her happiness. He is. As young James grew from infant to toddler, Lucas and Charlotte expanded both their family and their ranch. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them in 1881, followed by another son, William, in 1883. The Rocking W prospered, becoming one of the territory's most successful operations. Charlotte never forgot the fire that had taken her family and left her scarred. Each year on the anniversary, she and Lucas would visit the old Keating property, now a thriving rose garden that the new owners maintained out of respect for the family's memory. "Mama, why is your face different here?" 4-year-old James asked one day, his small fingers gently touching her scarred cheek. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Lucas before answering. "I was in a fire when I was younger. The fire marked my skin, but it also taught me how strong I could be." James considered this solemnly. "You're the prettiest mama anyway," he declared, before running off to play with his siblings. "From the mouths of babes," Lucas said, wrapping his arm around her waist. Charlotte leaned into his embrace. "He has his father's discerning eye." "And his mother's generous heart," Lucas replied, kissing her temple. 10 years after their wedding, Charlotte stood on their porch watching Lucas teach young William to ride. Elizabeth was helping Mrs. Gunderson in the kitchen, while James, now a miniature version of his father, practiced roping techniques with Mr. Sullivan. Contentment washed over Charlotte as she surveyed her family and home. The Rocking W had expanded to include prime grazing land and the finest horse breeding operation in the territory. Their home had grown too, with additions to accommodate their children and frequent guests. Lillian visited every summer, bringing presents and stories from St. Louis. Mrs. Jenkins had retired from the millinery shop, but remained a beloved aunt to the Walker children. Even Charlotte's scarred appearance had become simply another fact of Helena life, unremarkable to those who knew her well. That evening, after the children were asleep, Lucas found Charlotte in their bedroom, brushing her honey blonde hair, now threaded with occasional strands of silver. He came up behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror as he gently took the brush from her hand. "You know what day this is?" he asked, running the brush through her silky tresses. Charlotte smiled. "Of course. It's the anniversary of the day we met when I dropped my basket in Paulson's store." "The luckiest day of my life," Lucas said, setting down the brush to massage her shoulders. 10 years ago, I saw a beautiful woman trying to hide from the world, and somehow I convinced her to have dinner with me." "You saw beyond my scars when no one else would," Charlotte said softly, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. Lucas turned her to face him. "I saw you, Charlotte. Just as I see you now, the love of my life, mother of my children, mistress of my home, keeper of my heart." He traced the scarred contours of her cheek with gentle fingers. "Still perfect." Charlotte rose and wrapped her arms around his neck. A decade of love had taught her the truth of his words. Her scars hadn't diminished over the years, but their importance had. They were simply part of her story, the story of a woman who had survived flames and grief to find love in the arms of a cowboy who had seen beyond appearances to the heart within. "I love you, Lucas Walker," she whispered against his lips. "And I love you, Charlotte Walker," he replied, "every perfect inch of you." As moonlight spilled through their bedroom window, Charlotte and Lucas reaffirmed the love that had begun with a chance encounter, a dropped basket, and the quiet courage to see beyond scars to the beauty they couldn't conceal. Their story of loss and discovery, of perseverance and acceptance, of family built on genuine love had become part of Helena's legends, a testament to seeing with the heart what eyes alone might miss. Years later, When their children were grown with families of their own, when the Rocking W had become one of Montana's landmark ranches, Charlotte and Lucas would still sit together on their porch, hands clasped, as they watched the sunset paint the distant mountains. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, droughts and blizzards, economic hardships and personal losses, but their love had never wavered. And sometimes, when visitors would remark on their enduring devotion, Lucas would smile at his wife with the same admiration that had lit his eyes on that first day in Paulson's store. "It's simple," he would say. "From the moment I met her, I knew Charlotte was perfect. It just took her a while to believe it too." In those moments, Charlotte would touch her scarred cheek briefly, remembering a time when she had believed those scars defined her. How wrong she had been. They had merely been the map that led her to Lucas, to a love that had healed wounds far deeper than those visible on her skin, to a life fuller and richer than she could have imagined on that terrible night when flames had claimed her old world and unknowingly opened the door to a new one. For in the end, it wasn't the absence of scars that made a person perfect, it was the courage to wear them openly, to live fully despite them, and to accept love when it was offered with open hands and an understanding heart. That was the lesson Charlotte Keating Walker carried with her through all the days of her life, a lesson she had learned from a cowboy who had looked beyond surface appearances to the perfect soul within.